Today's subject is slavery.
Good day, YouTube. I once again present myself. The matter to which this video pertains is the repugnant institution of slavery. To be more precise, the endeavours of the Britons to expunge its presence globally. Slavery is a most reprehensible practice, and one which has haunted mankind for millennia, and quite literally for the entirety of its fugacious existence. Whilst the left oft partake in sophistry around Europe's participation in the practice, such comprised of its employ within Europe to besmirch Europe as a more flagitious civilization, such is fallacious. Merely the fastidious documentation of the practice lends credence to this perception, with other cultures partaking to a much greater degree, yet failing to take notice of the system which they partook in. On the contrary to these ne'er-do-well suppositions, Europe, and foremost Britain, ought not to be exculpated, but however lauded upon their merits in extinguishing both the trade and use of indentured labour, notwithstanding penal instances. Rather, Europe is an aberration in the paradigm of global tendencies, slavery particularly apparent in this vein. Abolitionism, hitherto British intercession, whilst diminutive compared to the aforementioned, nonetheless present, vis-a-vis ecumenical exhortations of Christian parity and the whims of various monarchs. This is not to forsake the metaphorical and oft literal blood drenching European hands. However, if one were to be less transfixed upon their pretensions and prejudices, they would find invariably that all palms are stained by the practice, irregardless of ethnicity or culture. This paradigm likewise pervades into victims. Europeans were oft subjugated, most evident the prodigious slave-taking, which the Romans partook in. 1/3 of Gauls were bound in the conquest of Gaul, with another third slain. The depredations of the Vikingers, not to deviate, but Viking is a verb, not a noun. The practice of purveying one's own children, or oneself as labour. And the Barbary pirates, whom ravished the shores of Italy and assailed Mediterranean trade. As you may have been elucidated if you witnessed the antecedent video, you would have been apprised of the reason that the Britons possessed Christianity as their religion, that of our people having been enslaved and transported to Rome. However, until contemporaneous European civilization, slavery ran unfettered and incontinent across the world. The Aztecs slaughtering sundry of their own ranks from the Flower Wars for sacrifice to their pagan deities, which desiderated blood. The African empires feeding themselves on the profits of their incursions against one another, and the Arabs peddling captives. Notwithstanding the slight amelioration in standards for Roman thralls in the wake of the ruinous Spartacus revolt, which engendered a perturbation in preceding sentiments, that the slaves were beholden to the Romans alone, and would not dare to slight their masters. This, of course, culminated in provision of emolument in some instances, and a prescription upon corporal punishment, as well as the capacity to purchase one's own freedom. The idiosyncrasies of this warranting their own video in and of themselves. However, there were no real alterations in the treatment of subjugates. Even in the contemporary era, there are those whom exhort the glories of this antiquated tenet. Socialists of all spectrums utilising slave labour, especially of those deemed class enemies, particularly those of a differing ethnicity or class. Apoplectic racists, whom despite believing in the capitalist system, nonetheless laud the practice, and those in North Africa, whom still use chattel slavery to this day. Therein, it is imperative to apprise you as to the deleterious effects of slavery upon the populace and the economy, and therefrom, with this predication outlined, we may look upon the founders of British abolitionism in earnest.
Way down south in the land of traders, rattlesnakes and alligators. Right away, come away, right away, come away. Where cotton's king and men are chattels, Union boys will win the battles. Right away, come away, right away, come away.
To commence, we may dedicate ourselves to deliberation upon the moral iniquities of slavery. Whilst tacit, some are still oblivious as to that which characterises slavery as noisome. Firstly, man, unlike beasts of burden, are not befitting of the yoke. Man deviating from this standard exceeds the needs of the beast and holds the capacity for rumination and a more poignant sense of emotion. Pavlov's triangle of needs illustrating this fact rather expediently and voraciously. Furthermore, man by virtue of being an agent of their own will, notwithstanding genetic determinist arguments, I myself being an adherent and proponent of such, however despite genes one still perceives the world through the present and sensually. But I digress, retains the capacity to transfer their conscious effort into nature. By virtue of this, they may homestead, or rather metamorphose nature into property. One may construe this to be the work of the soul, or ardor, depending on their religious sensibilities. Most apt and succinct of this perception are the ruminations of John Locke, the oft-cited father of liberalism, whom espouses upon the nature of property The labour of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labour with it, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property, it being by him removed from the common state nature placed it in. It hath by this labour something annexed to it, that excludes the common right of other men, for this labour being the unquestionable property of the labourer. Therein, if one subscribes to liberal thought, be it libertarian or paleoliberal, slavery is immediately circumscribed as a violation of the sovereignty of property, that one body has the capacity to be subsumed within natural features through the taxative effort of labour, the synthesis being that of property, then one must acknowledge the autonomy of the human body. By virtue of the capacities endowed upon us either by our divine progenitor or our arbitrary sapience, we are able to create property through application of property. Like an implement, one may say, in a manner redolent of using a shovel to excavate a trench, the trench is still one's own property, as of using property to ferment that. Hence, the human body is property of the one whom controls it, and by that I mean the individual. Conversely, the lower life forms of this planet are bereft of this capacity and conduct themselves upon mere bestial urges and propensities. Cattle, after all, do not claim ownership of the field which they sate themselves upon, as they do not effectuate change within their environment, merely instead reaping its boons. Anyhow, likewise, slavery is a direct and flagrant contravention of the NAP. For those unacquainted in libertarian thought, the non-aggression principle, hence the acronym NAP, is foremost revered, this precept upon which all other assertions of liberty are predicated. The NAP is a form of social contract whereby depredation of any kind, assault, rapine, plunder, are forsaken as to allow coexistence. Locke eloquently expounds upon this matter in The State of War, chapter 3 of the second treatise, in 2 treatises of government. When all cannot be preserved, the safety of the innocent is to be preferred, and one may destroy a man who makes war upon him, or has discovered an enmity to his being, for the same reason that he may kill a wolf or a lion, because they are not under the ties of the common law of reason, have no other rule but that of force and violence, and so may be treated as a beast of prey, those dangerous and noxious creatures that will be sure to destroy him whenever he falls into their power. Furthermore, from this it may be surmised that one who contravenes the NAP is forfeit of their natural rights, is concomitant with the exit from the state of nature to that of a beast, in that one is not accorded mutual rights with the forsaking of the other individual's rights, and thus the right to self-defense and seizure of property in such a circumstance exist. Slave-taking depriving one of their property and all liberties. Hence, with chattel, the system of human cattle, wherein the offspring of the enslaved are likewise subjugated, is inherently reprehensible and a violation of the rights of that newborn. The adult slaves, most oft procured from trade with African tribes, of which practice mutual conflict and slave raiding, thus the adults may be considered in a similar state as penal labour, albeit even this is of spurious morality, despite the parents forfeiting their right for a fray. Notwithstanding the ethereal moral principles, we must turn to economic matters. On the contrary to the common conception of slavery as an economic positive, such a view is asinine, with voluntary labour far more auspicious to economic growth. This comprehension derived from multiple points, that of the enslaved being devoid of any incentive to engage in travail, with those indentured labouring an attenuated efficiency. This rather tacit and understandable, as a price incentive works far better than the whip. Secondly, there is that of their general exclusion from the market. With rudimentary understanding of capitalism, this is a rather evident issue and one most exigent. Therein, by obviating the issue of employing workers rather than electing for unpaid slaves, plantations would not generate a collective increase in value. Remunerations imperative for economic growth, with other purveyors able to reap the benefits of the productivity of a venture by providing goods to workers in exchange for capital, thus allowing expansion and further expenditure, which thus repeats the cycle, with that proprietor then proceeding to spend their wealth. The Mises Institute, a leading think tank of the Austrian School of Economics, in their article Slavery, Cronyism, Opportunity Cost, and Deadweight Loss by Joshua Mahorter, opines upon the supposition that slavery served to greatly behoove the American economy of the early 19th century. It is often flippantly claimed that everyone in America benefited from slavery, except the slaves, or that slavery did make America rich at the expense of the slaves. Neither of these statements are true. Slavery did exploit the slaves at the expense of others, the slaveholding elite, but while often profitable for them, it did not in fact benefit everyone except the slaves, nor was it the source of general economic growth. In fact, slavery was costly for everyone, except for a few slaveholding elites allied with the state, and it did not produce greater wealth. Rather, it was a deadweight loss on the economy. Likewise, this is corroborated by an excerpt from Deadweight Loss and the American Civil War by Jeffrey Rogers Hummel, asseverating, Southern slavery was indeed profitable, but nevertheless inefficient. It operated like other obvious practices, from piracy through monopoly to government subsidies. where individual gains did not translate into social benefits. In the terminology of economics, it was a system that imposed significant deadweight loss on the southern economy, despite being lucrative for slaveholders. Thus, by virtue of these two factors, I pray you are well apprised to the actual pernicious nature of slavery, and for those who harboured sympathies, that they are disabused. Hence the British, with their inherent penchant for both capitalism and the conception of rights, such pre-existent hitherto John Locke himself, who was a Briton, who wrote the two treatises, may be intimated to serve as the vector for abolitionism, this a deviation from all preceding history. In the matters of abolitionism within Britain, the progenitors of such a movement may be discerned as Evangelical Christian Association. Thereupon, the Quakers were the preponderant group. Furthermore, the Quakers themselves are a topic that ought to be discussed. Their fervent piety and sense of solidarity betwixt members perchance ascribed as the causative agent towards their proclivity towards manumittance. The Quaker movement traces back to their founding member George Fox. Fox, racked by revelations upon Christianity in 1647, such epiphanies including that there is one, even Christ Jesus, who can speak to thy condition, and consequently from his means of illumination, that of revelation, Fox intimated that one may converse directly with Jesus Christ, rather than being relegated to the use of a delegate in the form of a curate, and thus facilitating the expiation of sins. All this whilst residing in Mansfield, Nottinghamshire. The group derived their name from the trial to which Fox was summoned in 1650 on the 30th of October, wherein to magistrates Gavas Bennett and Nathaniel Barton responded to the alleged charge of blasphemy. This trial, from whence the appellation Quaker originates. Fox's autobiography postulating, Bennett was the first that called us Quakers, because I bade them tremble at the word of the Lord. The moniker Quaker were initially derisory. However, the denomination eventually grew fond of it and adopted it as their own. Summarily, the Quakers underwent a period of intense rapprochement by governmental authorities in the midst of sectarian repression enacted by the British government. Anyhow, over time their lot was alleviated from the trammels of oppression with the Declaration of Indulgence, 1687 to 1688, with an abject cessation of this oppression via the Act of Toleration, 1689. Likewise, the group harboured sundry idiosyncratic elements, much as with their name. Such entailed their general amenability to both women, and eventually enthusiasm towards abolitionism. This perchance derived from this preceding repression, endowing them with some greater modicum of sympathy for those likewise trod upon and relegated to fetters. That is societal as opposed to physical, however. As their eventual conscience grew upon slavery, they became some of the foremost vociferous proponents of abolition. Their desire for extrication likewise evidenced by their participation in the formation of myriad societies. Thereupon, case in point, such is substantiated by 9 of the 12 founding members of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, or the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, as it is alternatively stated, belonging to such a religious sect. This paradigm of Christians maintaining qualms upon society is nigh unerring, with those of the more radical or lucid amongst Christians possessing the temerity to deign those protagonists of the trade and practice as unchristian, with further scorn based upon this assertion. Another instance of this is John Newton, an evangelical, that consisting of Christians whom espoused the import of proselytization as a tenet of the faith, Anglican cleric whom resided within England. Congenital to the man was traversing the ocean. This inveterate penchant derived from his parentage, the father, John Newton the elder, a shipmaster of the Mediterranean. John Newton the younger, born 4th of August 1725, first took to sea at the age of 11 in the company of his father after a mere 2 years' tutelage as a boarder. After a paltry 6 voyages, his father retired in 1742. However, contravening his father's machinations to place his son in employ with a sugar plantation in Jamaica, John Newton signed on to serve with a merchant vessel in the Mediterranean. Point of folly, however, was his press-ganging into the Royal Navy in 1743 after attempting to visit some acquaintances. Thus he served aboard the HMS Harwich. After a calamitous attempt to desert, he was exposed to punitive measures most strenuous, demoted from midshipman to seaman, and tied to the hatch grating after a flogging and summary undressing from waist up. After this, he briefly deliberated over murdering the captain, casting himself aboard in suicide. Eventually, however, he convalesced entirely and forsook this, and when en route to India, he transferred to a slave ship destined for West Africa called the Pegasus. Consequently, he was forsaken in West Africa after a general state of acrimony bred between him and the crew of said vessel. The one he was left in the charge of, the slave dealer Amos Clow, conveyed Newton to the coast and consigned him to his wife, Princess Pei of the Sherbo people. Newton, after the fact, recounted how he was subject to identical treatment with which other thralls were, such characterized by rampant abuse with impunity. Newton lamented upon himself at the time as once an infidel and libertine, a servant of slaves in West Africa. After 3 woeful years, he was extricated by the crew of the Greyhound in early 1748, whom had been beseeched by his father to rescue him. Upon this fateful journey, he embraced Christianity. Ostensibly, he awoke in a tempest off the coast of County Donegal in Ireland, the vessel nearing the point of sinking. After praying to the Lord for clemency, the storm dispelled. By the time he had reached Great Britain, he was a stalwart adherent of evangelical Christianity after perusing through the Bible. His arrival on the 21st of March 1748, perceived by him as an anniversary of his awakening, celebrated annually by him, and henceforth embraced asceticism rather than his hitherto luxuriant and decadent lifestyle. Reminiscing on his induction to the ranks of the faithful, such was marred by his continued participation in the transatlantic trade. In 1763, he opined, "I cannot consider myself to have been a believer in the full sense of the word, until a considerable time afterwards." Albeit, having been both indentured and been privy of the universal incorporeal truth, he was now subject to a greater sympathy for those enslaved. By 1754, after being beset by a stroke, he abstained from further seafaring and the trade, whilst nevertheless continuing to invest within aforementioned transatlantic trade through his father's friend Joseph Manistee, with whom he had served as first mate, primarily through nepotism, within the intervening years. After becoming involved in the Anglican Church following a stroke, Newton became implicated in earnest with opposing the slave trade, whilst contributing to the aforementioned Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, formed in 1787. He also penned the Disquisition, Thoughts upon the African Slave Trade, in 1788, and divulged, after a plethora of years of silence upon the matter, the conditions to which slaves are exposed, and issued an apology, of a confession which comes too late. It will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me, that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders. This pamphlet of such popularity that it endured a reprint, with the first round also having one dispatch to every MP. He likewise expounds, so much light has been thrown upon the subject by many able pens, and so many respectable persons have already engaged to use their utmost influence for the suppression of a traffic which contradicts the feelings of humanity, that it is hoped this stain on our national character will soon be wiped out. From this quotation, we may discern the conception of slavery as the most redoubtable enemy, which besmirches both mankind and the nation, such perceived as unbecoming for Britain, yet most wretchedly continuing. The assertion that so many respectable people have already engaged to use their utmost influence, indicative of both the prolific nature of abolitionism within the higher orders of society, and the difficulty to which expunging slavery and the trade thereas such adopted a most onerous endeavour. Consequently, John Newton also served as an ally and counsel for William Wilberforce. In his youth, Wilberforce toyed with the idea of retiring from politics after his spiritual awakening. This, as you may know, a commonality amongst the abolitionists. However, he was rebuffed by Newton, who implored him to continue as an MP and serve God where he was. Additionally, whilst this is somewhat impertinent, John Newton adopted his 2 orphan nieces-in-law, those of his wife, with one of Newton's nieces, Alice Newton, marrying an Indian prince, Mahul. This just a piquant fact. On a more pertinent matter is his authorage of Amazing Grace. Its initial name, Faith, Review and Expectation, this published in Olney Hymns, 1779. The song, a piece which in essence serves as a lamentation of his contrition and a proclamation of the Lord's magnanimity. Some other notable early abolitionists include Hannah More, an English philanthropist and writer, whom was also subject to counsel by John Newton, and Granville Sharp, an English philanthropist and scholar, whom was one of the 12 founding members in the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. These two were invigorated in their advocacy by the military man and colonial administrator, who was likewise the founder of Georgia, James Edward Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe, a man of the Enlightenment, whom utilized the precepts of the rights of man in order to bring about the so-called Georgia experiment, wherein he managed to cajole the prohibition of slavery from 1735 to 1751 in the state predicated upon said rights of man. Anyhow, with his passing in 1785, the members of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, along with fellow abolitionists implicated with Oglethorpe, as well as new abolitionists such as William Wilberforce, all coalesced into the Clapham sect, this to be the main effectuating force of the movement. The last man of mention is to be William Wilberforce, the primary man whom led the movement, and whose legacy is inextricably bound to the slave trade. For sake of brevity, and by virtue of his general renown, I shall expedite his description. Born August 24th, 1759 in Hull to a bourgeois family, he attended Hull Grammar School from 1767. He was oft described as a rather sickly child with beleaguered eyesight. After the death of his father in 1768, he was dispatched to dwell with his more affluent aunt and uncle, as his mother struggled to cope despite being the sole child. He thus attended an indifferent, as he puts it, boarding school in Putney, and developed a precocious taste in evangelicalism by his beloved relatives, whom he has previously mentioned dwelt with. Following his mother becoming apprised as to the peculiar religious sentiments her son was developing from his transitory guardians, herself appalled as she was a standard Anglican, he was recalled back to Hull in 1771 as a 12-year-old and was relegated to a new school rather than resuming his time at the grammar school, as its headmaster had become a Methodist. As his exposure to Methodism and evangelicalism waned, so too did his general will, over time becoming thoroughly ingratiated with the general social milieu of decadence which pervaded Hull at the time. He became thoroughly a hedonist, but rather well enjoyed by his peers in university, including future Prime Minister William Pitt. He would be the first of the United Kingdom, as with the emergence of the new century, the Acts of Union would be passed under his purview. Anyhow, after achieving a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts by 1788, despite ostensibly languishing in terms of study, he would gallivant around Europe after entering politics. His conversion commenced in October 1784, where on a trip to France with his family and the younger brother of his former headmaster, he would be proffered a book entitled The Rise and Progress of Religion and the Soul. This provided to him by said younger brother, Isaac Milner. Summarily, he began a spiritual reformation. He began to awake early to read the Bible, journaled, and prayed. His pompous and indolent life he began to feel compunction over, and thus he entrusted himself to the service of God in penance of this, much to the derision of his fellow elite, with whom zealotry in religion was widely seen as a peculiar, eccentric, or humorous affair. Thus, with his parliamentary role and ardor, he possessed entirely the capacity to engender the alterations that the abolitionists desiderated so dearly. Now, with the stage set, we may conclude two things. Abolitionism is derived primarily from Christian thought, not exclusively in fact, and that abolitionism was a generally well promulgated supposition amongst the elite, albeit many did not wish to go through the travails required to actually induce these changes necessitated by their beliefs. With the prelude complete, abolitionism now possessed the pen, philosophers and writers, sword, parliamentary access, and pouch, philanthropists. Thus, we may see these prior discrete factors, unification, conclude in the change each yearned for. My sincere apologies as to the abrupt end. However, you may wait in alacrity for the next edition of this series, for it will be released shortly hereafter and be duly replete with the desired information. I pray all information is veracious, however, as usual, you needn't hesitate to disabuse any assertion or erroneous fact stipulated within the video. Likewise, feel free to proffer any advice upon any ameliorations I may make to subsequent treaties. This work is one of important today's social zeitgeist, one where both Europe, particularly Britain, and Christianity are incessantly impugned upon for past abuses, which, whilst reasonably introduced, are embellished beyond regard and employed with a malice unbecoming of any intellectual. Therein, I pray you enjoyed this disquisition of mine, and likewise do on the accompanying part. With that, I bid you farewell once more.